She was perfection made flesh, a living Barbie on over 1,000 magazine covers, the face that defined beauty for an entire generation. But for Claudia Schiffer, perfection was not freedom. It was prison. They crowned her the ice queen of fashion, the new Bardot, the timeless doll who would never age, never change, never be allowed to simply be human. But Claudia wanted only one thing the world refused to give her: to be Claudia. Just Claudia, the girl from Rheinberg who dreamed of becoming a lawyer before a nightclub encounter changed everything. Everyone wanted the fantasy. Nobody wanted the girl. With those words spoken years after her retreat from the spotlight, Claudia Schiffer captured the essential tragedy of being too perfect. She'd achieved everything the modeling industry could offer: the Guinness World Record for most magazine covers, the Chanel campaigns, the Karl Lagerfeld Muse status, wealth beyond measure, recognition that transcended fashion to become pure celebrity. And she discovered that all of it was a trap, a golden cage where the bars were made of beauty and the lock was perfection itself. Today, Claudia Schiffer lives quietly in the English countryside with her husband and children, rarely appearing in public, having traded immortality for the messy reality of being human. She's still alive, still beautiful in her 50s, still recognizable. But she's also a ghost haunting fashion's collective memory, the supermodel who escaped, who chose family over fame, who proved that even perfect dolls eventually need to breathe. Was her retreat a defeat or the bravest victory? When the whole world loves you for being perfect but has no interest in who you actually are, is walking away surrender? Or is it the only way to save yourself? But to understand why one of the most successful models in history had to run away from her own face, why the girl everyone wanted to be eventually couldn't stand being herself, we must go back to the beginning, to a quiet German town, to a teenager with completely different dreams, to the moment when everything changed forever. Rheinberg, West Germany, August 25, 1970. Claudia Maria Schiffer was born into solid middle-class respectability. Her father Heinz was a lawyer. Her mother Gudrun worked in the family law practice. This was not a family chasing glamour or fame. They valued education, discretion, privacy, the quiet satisfactions of professional success and family stability. Young Claudia absorbed these values, grew up expecting to follow a similar path. Study hard, perhaps become a lawyer like her father, live a respectable life in a small German town where everyone knew everyone and nothing dramatic ever happened. She was an introvert by nature, more comfortable with books than parties, the kind of child who needed time alone to recharge after social interaction. In school, she was bright but unremarkable, pretty but not in ways that suggested a future in modeling. She was tall and blonde and blue-eyed, certainly. So were many German girls. There was nothing in her childhood that predicted she would become one of the most photographed women in history, that her face would sell everything from jeans to perfume to the fantasy of perfect beauty itself. At 17, Claudia was thinking about university entrance exams, about studying law, about a future that had absolutely nothing to do with cameras or runways or fashion. She imagined herself in courtrooms arguing cases, using her intelligence rather than her appearance, making a difference through substance rather than surface. It was a reasonable dream for a smart girl from a good family in a quiet German town. Then came the night that changed everything, April 1987. Claudia was at a nightclub in Düsseldorf with friends, just another teenager out for the evening, when a modeling scout approached her. It was the kind of encounter that seems inevitable in retrospect, but was completely random in the moment. The right face in the right place at the right time, luck or fate or whatever you call the collision of beauty and opportunity that transforms ordinary lives. The scout saw something in Claudia that she didn't see in herself. Not just beauty. Germany had plenty of beautiful blonde girls, but a specific quality that cameras would worship. She looked like a modern Brigitte Bardot, the legendary French actress who defined sexuality and beauty in the 1960s. The pouty lips, the tousled blonde hair, the combination of innocence and sensuality that had made Bardot an international icon. Claudia had all of it updated for the late 1980s. This comparison would become both Claudia's fortune and her curse, the thing that made her famous and the thing that made her feel like she didn't exist as her own person. But in that moment, in the nightclub, she was just a 17-year-old being told she could be a model if she wanted. It seemed exciting, different from the law career path that had been laid out for her. Why not try? Her parents were skeptical. Modeling wasn't serious, wasn't respectable, wasn't what educated middle-class German girls did with their lives. But Claudia was curious, and 17 is the age when curiosity outweighs caution. She signed with an agency. She did test shoots. She started getting small jobs. And within months, it became undeniably clear that this wasn't just another pretty girl trying modeling. This was something different, something special, something the camera couldn't get enough of. Could this accidental beginning, the nightclub discovery, the interruption of carefully laid plans, have created both her extraordinary success and her eventual need to escape? Was Claudia Schiffer always uncomfortable being Claudia Schiffer rather than just Claudia, the girl who'd wanted to study law? The transformation from German teenager to global icon happened with breathtaking speed. In 1989, just 2 years after her discovery, Claudia was chosen by Guess Jeans to be the face of their brand, replacing Brigitte Bardot herself as their image. The campaign, shot by photographer Ellen von Unwerth, was instantly iconic. Claudia in high-waisted jeans and red lipstick, hair tousled perfectly, looking like a 1950s pinup girl transported to 1989. The images were everywhere. Billboards, magazines, bus stops, every surface where advertising lived. Suddenly, Claudia Schiffer wasn't just a successful young model. She was a phenomenon, a fantasy, the face that defined what beauty looked like as the 1990s began. At 19 years old, she was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. But the Guess campaign also cemented the comparison that would haunt her entire career. The new Bardot. Every article about Claudia mentioned it. Every interview asked about it. She was never allowed to be just Claudia Schiffer. She was always Claudia Schiffer, who looks like Brigitte Bardot. The echo of a legend, the copy rather than the original. It was simultaneously the foundation of her success and the thing that made her feel erased, replaced by a comparison to someone else. I am not Brigitte Bardot. I am Claudia. She said this over and over in interviews, trying desperately to assert her own identity, to be recognized as her own person rather than an updated version of someone else. But the world wasn't interested in nuance. The comparison was useful. It gave people an easy framework for understanding her beauty, a reference point that required no thought. Easier to say she's like Bardot than to actually see Claudia as a distinct individual with her own unique qualities. The frustration of this comparison would build for years, creating a resentment that Claudia tried to keep hidden beneath professional perfection. She understood that protesting too much would seem ungrateful. After all, being compared to Bardot had made her famous and wealthy. But it also meant she was always performing someone else's image, always living up to a fantasy that wasn't really hers. Always being loved for resembling someone else rather than for being herself. Then came Karl Lagerfeld, and Claudia's transformation from successful model to fashion deity was complete. Lagerfeld, the legendary designer who ruled Chanel with absolute authority, saw in Claudia his perfect muse for the 1990s. She embodied everything he wanted Chanel to represent. Classic beauty with contemporary edge, sophistication that felt accessible, the kind of perfection that looked effortless even though achieving it required relentless discipline and self-denial. Claudia became the face of Chanel, walking in show after show, appearing in campaign after campaign, photographed in the interlocking seas until her face and the brand became inseparable. Lagerfeld called her his German perfection, treating her with the mixture of affection and objectification that designers reserve for their favorite models. She was his creation, his vision made, flesh, the embodiment of his aesthetic ideals. She was also extraordinary at the job, professional to a fault, never late, never difficult, never taking a bad photograph. She understood exactly what Lagerfeld wanted before he asked, could hold any pose for however long necessary. Moved through the Chanel shows with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. She was the perfect model because she'd learned early to subordinate herself to others' visions, to be whatever people needed her to be. But being someone's muse, being the embodiment of a designer's fantasy, means surrendering your own identity to serve their vision. Claudia was brilliant at being what Lagerfeld needed. But who was she when she wasn't performing perfection for his camera and runway? Did anyone actually care? Did she even know anymore? The early to mid-1990s were Claudia's absolute peak when she transcended modeling to become a pure cultural phenomenon. She was everywhere, not just fashion magazines, but mainstream publications, talk shows, music videos, anywhere images were consumed. She appeared on over 1,000 magazine covers, earning a Guinness World Record that will probably stand forever in an era when magazine covers no longer carry the cultural weight they once did. She walked for every major designer. Her face sold everything: fashion, cosmetics, cars, perfume, even products that had nothing to do with beauty but wanted to be associated with perfection. She dated a famous magician, David Copperfield, and the relationship made headlines constantly. Two people who existed primarily as public spectacles trying to have something real between them. She earned millions of dollars. She was recognized instantly by people who had zero interest in fashion, had achieved the level of fame where she was simply Claudia, a one-name icon. She was one of the original supermodels, that brief era in the early 1990s when models became as famous as the clothes they wore, when they had real cultural power, when their faces alone could sell products and define beauty standards for millions. Along with Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, and Christy Turlington, Claudia represented the pinnacle of what modeling could achieve. Not just professional success, but genuine celebrity, cultural impact that extended far beyond fashion. But behind the perfection, the pressure was crushing and constant. Every photograph had to be perfect. Every public appearance had to maintain the image. She couldn't gain weight. Even a few pounds would be noticed and criticized. She couldn't cut her hair differently without it becoming news. She couldn't show any sign of aging or imperfection or humanity without people mourning the loss of the fantasy they'd projected onto her. They see perfection. I see pressure. Claudia said this in one of her rare moments of honesty about what success actually felt like from the inside. The world saw the most successful model of her generation, earning more money than seemed possible, adored by millions, living a fairy tale. Claudia saw a prison where the walls were expectations, where the sentence was perfection, where parole meant destroying the image that everyone loved, but that was slowly suffocating the actual person underneath. She wasn't allowed to be human. She had to be the timeless doll, forever young, forever perfect, forever available for consumption. The moment she showed any imperfection, any aging, any weight gain, any deviation from the ideal, people would declare the fantasy over, would move on to the next perfect face, would feel betrayed that the doll had dared to be human. Behind all that glamour was their unbearable loneliness nobody saw. When you exist primarily as an image, when people love the fantasy you represent but don't know or care about the actual person, do you start to lose yourself? Do you become the doll they want because being human isn't permitted? The identity crisis built slowly through the mid to late 1990s. Claudia was in her mid-20s at the absolute peak of her career, more successful than she'd ever imagined possible back in that Dusseldorf nightclub. But success had come at a cost she was only beginning to understand. She'd become a fantasy object, public property, someone the world felt entitled to consume and judge and compare to other beautiful women throughout history. The Bardot copycat comparison particularly tormented her. She'd spent nearly a decade trying to establish her own identity, to be recognized as Claudia Schiffer rather than the new Brigitte Bardot. But the comparison persisted because it was convenient. It gave people a shorthand for understanding her beauty without having to actually see her as a distinct individual. I am not a copy. I am me. She declared this with increasing frustration in interviews, trying to assert that she was a real person with her own identity separate from the comparison that had defined her career. But declarations don't change public perception. The world had decided who Claudia Schiffer was, the timeless blonde, the ice queen, the perfect doll, and they weren't interested in revisions or complications. The fantasy was more valuable than the reality. The modeling work itself had become mechanical, almost robotic. Claudia knew exactly how to pose, exactly which angles worked best, exactly what every photographer wanted before they asked. She'd mastered the job so completely that there was no challenge left, no room for growth or evolution. She was just performing a role she'd perfected years earlier, repeating the same performance over and over. The beautiful doll doing what beautiful dolls do, standing still and looking perfect while everyone else made art and money from her image. Her relationship with David Copperfield, which lasted from 1993 to 1999, illustrated perfectly the impossibility of having anything real when you exist primarily as a public fantasy. Copperfield was one of the most famous magicians in the world, known for spectacular illusions like making the Statue of Liberty disappear. Their relationship was immediately dubbed a fairy tale, the world's most beautiful woman dating the world's most famous illusionist, two people who literally made their livings creating fantasies for public consumption. At first, it seemed perfect. Both understood fame. Both knew what it meant to perform constantly. Both had to maintain carefully constructed public images. But that shared understanding was also the relationship's fatal flaw. Neither of them could ever fully stop performing, could never be entirely sure where the public persona ended and the private person began. Every dinner was photographed, every vacation was documented, every moment together was turned into content for magazines and tabloids hungry for images of the perfect couple. Copperfield proposed in 1994 and the engagement made international headlines. But the wedding kept getting postponed, delayed, pushed back. Looking back, it seems clear that both of them knew something was wrong, that the fantasy of their relationship was more compelling than the reality. They were trapped in the same cage, both objects of public fascination, both performing versions of themselves, both struggling to find authenticity beneath the carefully constructed images. When the engagement finally ended in 1999, the breakup was treated as entertainment rather than genuine human suffering. Tabloids speculated about what went wrong, who ended it, whether there was someone else. Claudia's pain, and there was real pain, the loss of 6 years invested in a relationship that hadn't worked, became just another story for public consumption. She couldn't grieve privately. Even heartbreak had to be performed for cameras, commented on by strangers who felt entitled to opinions about her personal life. Supermodel was never a job. It was a prison in disguise. This admission came much later after she'd left the industry, when she could finally be honest about what success had actually felt like. At the time, trapped inside the image, she couldn't say this publicly. She had to maintain the illusion, had to pretend that being one of the most successful models in history was pure glamour and privilege and joy. Admitting it felt like imprisonment would have destroyed the fantasy, and the fantasy was what people were paying for. She was wealthy, famous, beautiful, successful by every external measure. But inside, she was disappearing, being replaced by the image everyone loved, losing track of who Claudia actually was beneath the perfect surface. The girl who'd wanted to study law, who loved reading and privacy and quiet conversations, that girl was being suffocated by Claudia Schiffer, the icon, the fantasy, the doll that everyone wanted but nobody actually knew. Did this crisis mark a breakdown? Or was it the beginning of Claudia finally choosing herself after years of being what everyone else needed? Is losing your public identity to save your private self a tragedy, or the only form of rescue available? The decision to step back didn't come suddenly. It accumulated gradually, choice by choice, no by no. Claudia started declining more jobs, being more selective about projects, prioritizing her private life over public image in ways that confused people who thought fame was the ultimate goal, and couldn't understand why she'd voluntarily give it up. The decision to prioritize motherhood over modeling was more radical than it might seem from the outside. When Claudia became pregnant with her first child in 2003, she was still at an age when models could maintain successful careers. She was only 33, still beautiful, still in demand. The fashion industry expected her to do what successful models typically did: take a few months off, get back to pre-pregnancy weight as quickly as possible, resume working, hire nannies to handle the actual child care while she maintained her career. Claudia chose differently. She chose to actually be present for her children's lives. Not just physically present in the house while nannies did the real work, but emotionally present, engaged, prioritizing their needs over career opportunities. When her children were young, she turned down lucrative campaigns and prestigious runway shows because they would require too much time away from home. She chose school plays over fashion week, bedtime stories over photo shoots, ordinary maternal duties over the extraordinary opportunities that her face and name could still command. This choice baffled many people in fashion who saw it as waste. Here was Claudia Schiffer, still capable of earning millions, still able to grace any magazine cover, still beautiful enough to represent any luxury brand, and she was choosing to be a stay-at-home mother in the English countryside. They couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily give up that level of success and recognition for the mundane realities of parenting. But Claudia understood something they didn't: that she'd spent 15 years being public property, being the perfect fantasy for millions of strangers, and she'd nearly lost herself in the process. Her children gave her something no amount of fame or money could provide: a role that required her to be real, to be imperfect, to be valued for who she was rather than what she looked like. Motherhood demanded authenticity in ways that modeling never had. You can't fake being a mother, you can't pose your way through it. It requires showing up as your actual self, flaws and all. Her 3 children, Casper, Clementine, and Cosima, grew up largely shielded from the media attention that had consumed their mother's 20s and 30s. Claudia was fiercely protective of their privacy, rarely allowing them to be photographed, never using them for publicity, determined that they would have the normal childhood she'd lost when that modeling scout approached her in Dusseldorf. In protecting them, she was also protecting the last remnants of normalcy in her own life, creating a space where she could be just Claudia rather than Claudia Schiffer, the icon. The fashion world was baffled. Here was Claudia Schiffer, still beautiful enough to command any campaign, still famous enough to make headlines, still capable of earning millions for a few days' work. And she was turning most of it down to live like a normal, wealthy person rather than a global icon. It seemed like waste, like squandering the gift of extraordinary beauty by not exploiting it maximally. But from Claudia's perspective, she wasn't giving up anything valuable. She was escaping. She'd spent 15 years being the perfect doll, the timeless fantasy, the embodiment of ideal beauty. She'd achieved everything modeling could offer: the record-breaking covers, the Chanel campaigns, the Guinness World Record, the wealth and fame. Now she wanted what she'd sacrificed to get all that: the freedom to be imperfect, to age naturally, to exist privately, to simply be Claudia without the suffocating weight of Claudia Schiffer, the icon. She continued doing some modeling work, very selectively. Projects that interested her or paid extraordinarily well. But it was on her terms now, not the industry's. She wasn't chasing relevance or trying to maintain the image. She was a mother who occasionally modeled, not a model who happened to have children. The shift was subtle but profound, a reclamation of identity, a refusal to remain public property. Supermodel was a mask. I wore it too long. This admission, made in an interview years after her retreat, was remarkable, coming from someone who'd worn that mask so convincingly that most people couldn't imagine her without it. But Claudia understood what the public didn't. The mask, however beautiful and valuable, was still a mask. And wearing it constantly meant suffocating the person underneath, losing yourself to the image everyone else needed you to be. Can anyone who becomes an icon ever truly escape? Or does the image trap you forever, following you no matter how far you run, defining you long after you've stopped performing? The years since Claudia's retreat have created a strange paradox. She's still alive, still active in selective ways, still beautiful as she's allowed herself to age naturally rather than fighting desperately against time. But culturally, she exists primarily as a memory, a symbol of the 1990s supermodel era, a face frozen in that peak moment of perfect beauty. Fashion exhibitions about the supermodel golden age always feature Claudia prominently. The Guess campaigns, the Chanel shows, the endless magazine covers that made her a Guinness World Record holder. She's become a historical artifact while still being a living person, preserved in cultural memory at her moment of peak perfection, even as the actual Claudia continues living and changing and aging like any human being. The irony is that by retreating, by refusing to continue performing perfection, Claudia ensured her iconic status. She's not a middle-aged model desperately clinging to relevance, doing ads for anti-aging products, fighting against time in full public view. She's the supermodel who disappeared at her peak, who chose family over fame, who became a legend partly because she stopped being constantly available for consumption. Her 3 children are being raised largely out of the public eye, a conscious choice by Claudia to give them the privacy she never had during her modeling years. She rarely posts on social media, rarely gives interviews, rarely does anything to remind the world she still exists. This creates a strange effect. People remember Claudia Schiffer as eternally young, eternally perfect, the timeless blonde who defined 1990s beauty. The actual Claudia, aging naturally in her 50s, living quietly in the English countryside. That Claudia is almost invisible. Is this what she wanted? To be remembered as perfect while living as human? To have her legacy secured while her actual life remains private? It seems to be working. Claudia has achieved an escape that few icons manage. She's not constantly defending her relevance or updating her image or fighting to stay visible. She's simply living, quietly, away from the cameras that once documented her every angle. The fashion industry occasionally tries to lure her back for special projects, anniversary campaigns, reunion shows, nostalgic celebrations of the supermodel era. Sometimes she agrees, appearing briefly to remind everyone why she was special, then disappearing again into private life. These appearances feel like a ghost visiting from the past, giving the living a glimpse of perfection before vanishing back into whatever realm legends inhabit. The relationship with Karl Lagerfeld deserves deeper examination because it encapsulates everything about Claudia's career. The opportunities, the artistry, the recognition, but also the cost of being someone's perfect muse. Lagerfeld was a genius, undoubtedly one of the most influential designers of the 20th century. When he chose Claudia as his muse for Chanel in the early 1990s, he gave her opportunities most models could only dream of. Front-row positioning in every show, the most prestigious campaigns, association with one of fashion's most iconic brands. But Lagerfeld's genius came with demands. He had an exact vision of what Chanel should be, and Claudia was expected to embody that vision perfectly every single time. There was no room for experimentation, no space for Claudia to bring her own ideas or personality to the work. She was his canvas, his instrument, the tool through which he expressed his artistic vision. And she was brilliant at it, so brilliant that she made it look effortless, which only increased the pressure to maintain that level of perfection constantly. Lagerfeld rarely spoke about models as individuals with their own identities. To him, they were elements of a larger artistic composition, beautiful objects to be arranged and photographed and styled according to his vision. Claudia understood this. She was professional enough to accept her role. But understanding it intellectually didn't make it less dehumanizing emotionally. Year after year of being treated as a perfect object rather than a complicated person takes a psychological toll that success and money can't heal. When Lagerfeld died in 2019, Claudia spoke at length about their relationship for the first time, with the honesty that only comes when someone is gone and can't contradict your version of events. She praised his genius, acknowledged the opportunities he'd given her, expressed genuine gratitude for what their collaboration had achieved. But she also carefully admitted that being his muse had required suppressing her own identity, that the perfection he demanded had been exhausting, that she'd sometimes felt more like a mannequin than a person in his presence. It was as close as Claudia had ever come to admitting publicly what the cost of iconic status had been. The impact of Claudia's retreat on the modeling industry and subsequent generations is worth examining. By walking away at the height of her powers, by choosing family over fame when she could have continued commanding top fees for years, Claudia created a template that few models have followed but many have quietly admired. She proved that you could be hugely successful in modeling and still choose something else, that the industry didn't own you forever just because it had made you famous. Younger models who came after her, particularly those who'd watched the supermodel era from the outside, learned from Claudia's example that fame was optional, that you could have a successful modeling career without surrendering your entire identity to the industry. Models like Christy Turlington, who also stepped back to focus on maternal health advocacy and family, followed a similar path. The era of models who existed solely as fantasy objects, who had no identity outside their image, was ending partly because women like Claudia had shown there was another way. But Claudia's influence extends beyond just the modeling world. In an era increasingly dominated by social media, where fame seems to be the ultimate goal and privacy is treated as worthless, Claudia's choice to disappear, to protect her private life, to refuse constant public consumption, that choice looks increasingly radical and even countercultural. She's living proof that you can achieve massive success and then simply stop, walk away, choose something else. Refuse to continue performing for an audience that will never be satisfied. Contemporary celebrities, particularly women who've achieved fame for their beauty, face a different kind of pressure than Claudia did. The expectation that they'll share everything constantly, that they'll monetize every aspect of their lives that they'll never stop performing for the cameras that now exist in everyone's pockets. Claudia's retreat, her refusal to participate in this constant performance, offers an alternative model that feels almost subversive in its insistence on privacy and boundaries. Her legacy in fashion is absolutely secure. She's remembered as one of the greatest supermodels, part of that holy era when models transcended fashion to become cultural phenomena. The 1,000-plus covers, the Chanel campaigns, the Guess images, all preserved in fashion history, studied by students, celebrated in retrospectives, iconic and unchanging. But perhaps the more important legacy is the example she's setting now, choosing to be human over remaining perfect, choosing privacy over fame, choosing family over icon status. In an era of constant self-promotion, of celebrities who can't imagine life outside the spotlight, Claudia Schiffer's quiet retreat is almost radical. She's proving it's possible to be an icon and still be human, to have your image frozen in cultural memory while you continue living and changing privately. The tragedy of Claudia's career is that she was so perfect at being a fantasy that people forgot she was real. The triumph is that she eventually remembered it herself and chose reality over fantasy, even knowing that reality is harder, messier, less glamorous, and infinitely more valuable than any image. I am not Brigitte Bardot. I am Claudia. She fought for years to establish this, to be seen as herself rather than an echo of someone else. But the fight was impossible to win while remaining in the public eye, while continuing to perform perfection. Only by retreating, by refusing to be the perfect doll, could she finally become just Claudia. Not the supermodel, not the timeless beauty, not the fantasy object, but a woman living her life away from cameras and judgments and the crushing weight of perfection. Claudia Schiffer didn't fade. She escaped. She traded perfection for freedom, immortality for life, the timeless image for the messy reality of being human. And in making that choice, she achieved something perhaps more remarkable than all her magazine covers combined. She proved that being human is braver than being perfect, that choosing yourself is more important than pleasing the world, that walking away from fame when it becomes a prison is not defeat but the most courageous victory. So what do we learn from Claudia's story? That perfection is a trap, that being an icon means sacrificing your humanity, that the fantasy others project onto you can suffocate who you actually are, that it's better to be real than perfect, that privacy is more valuable than fame, that choosing to be human, aging, imperfect, private, is braver than maintaining an illusion of timeless perfection. Today in 2025, Claudia Schiffer is 54 years old and living a life that would be unrecognizable to the 19-year-old who'd posed for those first Guess campaigns. She divides her time between London and a country estate in Suffolk, rarely appearing in public except for carefully chosen projects that genuinely interest her. She's developed a second career as a fashion curator and consultant, working on museum exhibitions and archival projects that allow her to engage with fashion history from behind the scenes rather than in front of cameras. Her relationship with fashion has evolved into something healthier, more sustainable. She can appreciate the artistry and history of the industry without having to sacrifice herself to it. She collects vintage fashion, has amassed one of the world's most impressive private collections of couture and photography, and occasionally loans pieces to museum exhibitions. It's a way of staying connected to the world that made her famous while maintaining the boundaries that allow her to actually live. She's also become quietly philanthropic, supporting causes related to children's welfare and education, though she does this work largely out of public view. Unlike many celebrities who use charity work for publicity, Claudia seems genuinely uninterested in credit or recognition. The girl who spent 15 years being photographed from every angle has learned to value work that happens outside the frame, impact that isn't measured in magazine covers or social media engagement. Her marriage to Matthew Vaughn has lasted over 2 decades, an unusual longevity in a world where celebrity relationships typically self-destruct under public pressure. Friends attribute this success partly to their shared commitment to privacy, to building a life together that exists primarily away from cameras and public scrutiny. Vaughn, as a film director, understands the performance aspects of public life, but has also built his career largely behind the camera rather than in front of it. They seem to have created a space where both can be their actual selves, rather than performing curated versions for public consumption. When Claudia does give rare interviews now, she speaks with a candor and self-awareness that would have been impossible during her modeling peak. She's honest about the psychological costs of being perfect, about the identity crisis that came from being loved for her surface rather than her substance, about the relief of finally being allowed to age naturally without constant judgment. She doesn't romanticize her supermodel years or pretend they were entirely negative. She acknowledges the opportunities, the artistry, the incredible experiences. But she's also clear that the cost was nearly unbearable, that she came very close to losing herself entirely, that walking away saved her life in ways that might not be visible but were absolutely real. If the whole world only loves you for your perfection, are you still yourself? Or just a doll in someone else's display case? And is Claudia Schiffer's retreat from the spotlight an act of defeat or the greatest victory an icon can achieve?